Hello, my name is Reggie Chapman. I am the Director of Policy at the Fortune Society's David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, which is a discussion driven show that examines the criminal legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the system. Here we discuss critical questions about how the criminal legal system works, its intersections with social justice, and the efforts that advocates are making to improve the lives of everyone involved. We ask that you, the viewers, spread the word about both sides of the bars and share your comments with us on Twitter, also known as X at the Fortune SOC. Today's show is titled Mental Health and Incarceration. In this episode, we examine the relationship between mental health and incarceration and how untreated mental health, trauma, substance use contribute to the involvement in the criminal legal system. We also discuss how incarceration can worsen psychological harm and highlight the importance of trauma informed care and community based support during reentry. Today's guest for the show is Dr. Sarah Thomas. Dr. Thomas is a researcher and assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. Her work examines the mental health and developmental impacts of incarceration with a focus on trauma, psychological functioning, and long term well being. It also seeks to inform more effective healing center approach to justice and reentry. Good afternoon, Dr. Thomas.
Good afternoon.
And so we're excited to have you on the show, and we're excited for you to share your research and your perspectives concerning this phenomenon. So, how about we just jump into the questioning?
Sounds great.
So, can you walk us through what happens to a person's mental health over time when they're exposed to the carceral environment?
Sure, absolutely. So, I think the first thing that I want to sort of bring attention to is just the disruptive nature of being incarcerated, right? Our participants talk about that as like being taken off the map, right? You're sort of going about your day, you've got plans for going to work, for paying your bills, for picking up your kid after school. And then when you're arrested, all of that sort of disappears, right? And the longer you're incarcerated, the more that life is going on the outside while you're on the inside. And so there's a cost to that, right? In terms of sort of missing big pieces, important pieces of your life. The second thing that we hear about from our participants is the mental challenges of being incarcerated. What's required every day to survive, to keep yourself safe. Our participants talk to us a lot about the need for hypervigilance, being always prepared for something bad potentially to happen. And they also talk to us about the loss of agency, right? Not being able to decide when they're going to go somewhere, when they're going to eat, what they can eat, what activities they're able to pursue, when they can see their families. And all of those really bear weight on, how the things that we think are of as most important for being human, right? And then, I would just say we hear participants talk a lot about the challenge of navigating the mental health space of trying to stay safe while they're in, but also keeping attached to the part of themselves that's going to need to function on the time when they get out, right? And there's a balancing act that takes a lot of cognitive load. We did a study actually where we looked at mental health outcomes of people who had been incarcerated. And we found that men who had been in prison had worse mental health outcomes, had a higher risk of having poor mental health outcomes than those who had ever been to jail. And we found that each additional year of time spent in prison led to worse mental health outcomes.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for providing that insight. And you said a number of things that I found to be fascinating. But the two things I want to highlight or at least speak to, you mentioned the idea of just having to, like, the cost of incarceration, the type of work that goes into maintaining one's sanity. And I'm actually formerly incarcerated myself. And so I have a first person perspective when it comes to that.
Mhm.
We often talk about this idea of like being in a constant state of fear and or tension per se. And what happens over time, I think, is that like we have like this low grade stress, but it lasts for so many years, and you kind of normalize stress and pressure, and I think that's important too in conjunction when you talk about having to be in a certain headspace in a mental space while incarcerated, but at the same time maintain that part of self that would allow you to be effective once you're released into the environment. And so I find those two takes to be fascinating when we talk about the mental health, specifically the mental health and the trauma impacts of incarceration. So I thank you for that perspective, Professor.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I want to go to our next question. So
Okay.
from your research, and you mentioned your research too, so it's maybe like a redundant question, and if so, we can just kind of go past it. But like you talked about your research, what are the most common mental health conditions people bring with them into the system, and how does incarceration tend to reshape or intensify those conditions?
Sure. So I work with the Northwestern Juvenile Project. So we studied kids when they were in juvenile detention, and we've been following them through the years. Um, we found that 2/3 of boys and 3/4 of girls had a mental health disorder when we first met them. The most common was substance use disorders. The second most common were behavioral disorders, like conduct disorder or oppositional defiance disorder, which we would expect, right? Those are disorders that sort of cause people to act out and get in trouble. And then the third most common were mood disorders, which the most common of those is depression. Um, I think I want to also bring attention to the fact that those are sort of diagnosable mental health disorders, but that leaves out the piece about just trauma. When our kids came to us, they were, median age 15 years old. And the question very early on stopped being whether they had experienced trauma and instead became how many traumas they had experienced. So when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about witnessing severe violence, uh, to the point that somebody is extremely hurt or potentially has been killed, experiencing violence yourself, being sexually abused. Our kids had experienced a median of 6 traumas when they got to us, right? Remember, these are teenagers. And a quarter of our participants had lost a caregiver. So that just that load of trauma coming in, I think doesn't get talked about enough.
Well, this is a fascinating response. First of all, fascinating research and fascinating commentary. So, as I said to you previously, I'm actually formerly incarcerated, but I was also incarcerated as a youth, and I'm currently I'm a public health researcher. I'm actually an epidemiologist, and I just actually did a policy brief on the public health impacts of youth incarceration. And throughout that research, one thing we were highlighting, what you're highlighting, is adverse child experiences, ACEs. And so,
Yep. Yep.
many young people that are involved with the system because of the environments they come from already come into contact with the judicial system, already having had those issues, and so it's only exacerbated by the carceral system. And when you talk about the type of mental health disorders in our problems, you mentioned mood disorder, and it just totally makes sense when we talk about young people facing a great deal of trauma while they're home and then coming into the system and having those traumas exacerbated. And mood disorders show up in various ways. They show up in one's ability to be able to socialize, one's ability to acquire education and be in structured environments, and just be a functioning person within society, in the work environment, in the school environment. And so these things matter because they have an effect on the way in which people behave. I just find this research to be fascinating. I'm glad you spoke about it. I think it's something that we should really be highlighting when we talk about the type of disorders that one may encounter prior to, and how it's exacerbated when they go in, and how this has an effect on the environment and when they return to society. So I find that to be fascinating. Again, specifically this phenomenon of mood disorders and substance abuse as well. You mentioned substance abuse. I think that's one of the traumas and one of the problems that we see develop as a result of incarceration as it pertains to coping mechanisms within the space. So again, thank you for highlighting that. And I think that this is something that our audience will be glad to hear about.
And I guess I would add to that, you had asked about how incarceration might make it worse, right? And you think about some of those things like exposure to violence, and then you're going into a system where you need to be hypervigilant all the time because of the potential for violence, and you're separated from people who are your support system, and you're watching people die, on the outside while you're on the inside, and so all of those things that are traumatizing on the outside are exacerbated, and are made worse, through through being behind bars.
No, yes, yes. I'm glad you highlight that as well. It's something that came to mind as I was talking, but I failed to mention. Absolutely, this idea of like when you come into the carceral space, it's unfortunately it's a violent space and it desensitizes people in some cases. Well, at least before the desensitizing process, I think just the trauma that a person may experience by seeing violence, right, and then that being a normal phenomenon within the carceral space, and then transitioning back into out to the free world and then having to be a little bit more sensitive to the environment can be problematic in many instances. I know from my own lived experience, I was incarcerated from the age of 17 to 42, so I know quite well about being exposed to a great deal of violence over 2 decades and seeing that and have it be something normal and desensitizing you, but then coming home and then being in healthy spaces and over time, being able to identify things that are not normal, that were previous normal for myself, seeing violence. I can remember one time where living in a space where I actually see someone harmed, and it was at the point where it really, really bothered me. And that's how I knew that the type of therapy I have been getting and the type of reentry process treatment I've been getting was really, really working. Because prior to that, maybe that wouldn't have been so. So yeah, I definitely understand that phenomenon from a firsthand experience. So thank you for highlighting that.
Mm-hmm.
So how about we go to our next question?
Okay.
Many, and this is very, very important on the heels of that, because many people still view mental health illness through a public safety lens.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what does the evidence actually tell us about the relationship between untreated mental health and the needs of system involvement people?
This is a good place to remember or to remind everybody that when we're talking about mental health, we are talking about a huge range of different experiences and needs, right? And I think when we start to pull out that public safety lens, we tend to be thinking more about people who are acutely psychotic, maybe who are hearing or seeing things that the rest of us aren't, right? That tends to activate a lot of fear response that gets called to the police. The reality is that people with severe mental illness account for something like 3% of all crimes, right? They actually account for a very small proportion of what makes up the people who are in the criminal justice system. Um, People with severe mental illness are actually more likely to be victims of violent crime than they are to be perpetrators of violent crime. But what happens when we get anxious and we see somebody, in an acute mental health crisis? Who do we call? The first call tends to be to the police, and then the police have to do something. And right now, the way that the system is set up, there aren't a lot of good places to put somebody who's in a mental health crisis. There's like licensure restrictions. And so the catch-all place, right, the place that doesn't turn anybody away is a jail. And so unfortunately, then you get this rolling cycle of people who have mental health, disorders who are ending up in corrections. I am not
Thank you,
hearing.
Doc. It's
Oh,
ironic that you mentioned that, right? So, one of my follow-up questions, like down, I had a list of questions I was going to ask you, was really about like, we often hear about jails and prisons becoming the largest mental health providers in the country. And I was going to ask you, in your view, what are the biggest gaps or harms and how these institutions respond to the needs of that? And you kind of spoke to that, but I wonder if you can tease it out a little bit more.
sure. Um, I will say overwhelmingly from what I've heard and from talking to our participants, the biggest gap is the lack of staff. Um, Prisons and jails are just not adequately staffed to support the needs of people who are there. And that plays out in several different ways. Um, One is that, programs that are available for people who are incarcerated get shut down when there's not enough staff there. The only thing they can sort of do to keep everyone safe is just to lock everybody down and lock the doors and close everybody up. The second thing that happens is we've heard about staff being sort of cross trained in different roles. So nurses also serve as correctional officers. Correctional officers are being trained as crisis counselors. And from a sort of a knee-jerk reaction, that might seem like a really good idea, right? We're like, yeah, we want trauma-informed people, being staff in prisons or in jails. But what participants have told me is that the effect of that is actually that they're in crisis about their lived circumstances, which includes the correctional officers. And then a correction officer is coming to help them handle that crisis. And that creates a real conflict of interest, right? There's no real safety or space to be vulnerable and to talk about things that are really sensitive. Mental health is a very sensitive thing to talk about. It's vulnerable. And so if you don't have that space available, that creates a real problem. And we've heard stories where that ends really tragically. Um, I think just also when there's a lack of staffing, you have to sort of really pare down what you're able to offer in terms of acute mental health care, right? It goes to the people who need it the very most, who are in crisis. It goes to, sort of the easiest sort of low hanging fruit treatments, which are medications, which can work wonders, but it's often not enough to do a lot of what's needed. And so you're missing this huge group of people who need help, who need counseling, who need support. Um, so staffing, I would say, is a big piece. Um, and then I think to what we've spoken to already, right? Jails and prisons are not a safe place to be airing your vulnerabilities. And when so much of the work requires being vulnerable and requires the space to sort of step back and reflect, or, sort of be in that space where the trauma is bubbling up, that prison is not a place to do that. And so, I think there's just a real, I don't quite have a solution for that, right? But there's not a safe place to do that.
And I appreciate that totally. And as you were saying that, if you would interview me, I would have told you the same thing. Again, in the carceral space, it's not a safe space. Oftentimes, the trauma and the violence that a person may experience may have came at the hands of staff, and if you have staff involved in the treatment, it just doesn't work that. And I can just tell you, being within the carceral space for 2 decades and a half, there's not a lot of trust between medical staff and an incarcerated person, and the harm or the stigma that comes with mental health issues. Individuals are not even like, prior to the carceral space, they're not even like encouraged to seek out treatment. When you think
Mhm.
about a significant proportion of the prison calls in the prison space come from Black and Brown communities, which we know historically have an adverse relationship with the healthcare system, and therefore are very, very distrustful of it. When you think about that same element in the carceral space, it's even more problematic. And so I can tell you from firsthand experience, oftentimes people don't seek treatment from staff, medical staff, or if any, and that in itself is problematic. Even if we did have enough staff, I think it's a little bit more about the culture inside the carceral space that
Mhm.
makes that problematic. So I
Mhm.
definitely appreciate you for sharing that sentiment. You also, in your research, you also talked about using mixed method approach. Is there a particular story uh, uh, or that you find to be phenomenal that illustrates the importance of the impact that human beings have as it pertains to the data?
Yeah, I actually carry sort of a whole chorus of people who I've interviewed, but to share one that's sort of particularly relevant to our discussion today, you know, um, I'll refer to her as Aaliyah. I'm going to protect her real name for her privacy. You know, um, Aaliyah came from a background with significant trauma, right? Physical and sexual abuse. She lost one of the people who was her biggest advocate in helping to protect her from some of that abuse. Um, and that led her to befriending people who were getting in trouble, and it led her into the road of getting involved with drugs, which of course you know um, snowballed into her being arrested and incarcerated. And so she's been in and out of jails since she was a teenager, when we met her. And she is schizophrenic. She hears voices, and she finds those to be very distressing. And so now she's got what we call comorbid disorders, right? She's got schizophrenia and she's got a substance use disorder. And when you've got two disorders going on together, that makes them infinitely harder to treat. It's not like you can just treat them as two separate disorders. It becomes more complicated. And so she's repeating this pattern where she's going in and out. And when she's in, she has sort of two options of where to be. She can be in the general population, but she often finds that to be quite overwhelming, distressing, loud. It's very overwhelming for her. You can, when she talks about it, her whole body and face just sort of close up because it's so traumatizing to her. Um, and so oftentimes she gets put in the mental health ward, which has some benefits to her. It's quieter, it's much smaller. She gets counseling that she needs. Um, but she's really trying to make it when she gets back into the community, right? Her hope is to get off of drugs, to be able to keep a job, to, function. And all of the tools that she feels like she needs, all of the programming that exists in general population. And so there's this real tug of war of where she wants to be and how to sort of set herself up for success, because so far she's just been rotating in and out, and she feels really stuck. And she feels like she has these two needs that from the outside, right, we could see are very clear and we could offer them to her, right? She needs some counseling and she needs some programming. And while she's behind bars, she sort of gets to have one or the other.
Thank you, Doc. I thank you for providing that. You know, I think that Aaliyah's stories highlights something that's actually kind of common in the carceral space when we talk about the mental health impacts of incarceration. And it makes me think about when you just said about this idea of, balancing how do we get the type of treatment in the space and still be able to keep the person safe. And so that kind of like allows me to segue to my next question, which is that, you know, how can the trauma informed approach realistically be implemented within systems that are inherently punitive, and what would need to change for that to happen?
Yeah. I think to answer that, I need to infuse a little bit of idealism into that realism. You know, I think we have some reckoning to do as a society about what what we want prisons to do and how we think they should operate. And I think until we come to the place where we can say, you did something bad that we don't accept as a society, and we'd like to help you return to society, there's not a lot of places we can go, right? When our space is not just you did something bad you know, that needs to be rehabilitated, but you are a bad person who deserves to be punished and shamed and, deprived of your humanity. There's nowhere you can go from that space, right? There's no influx of resources, there's no influx of staff, there's no influx of support. So, I think we need a cultural shift that says, hey, let's look at this actually as rehabilitative, right? As yes, yes, we are saying for a moment, maybe step away from society, but you still get to maintain your basic human dignity of, food, safety, good sleep. You are not going to be re-traumatized in this space, right? Those are sort of bare bones things that could be happening that would move more towards that trauma informed care space. Um, I think offering so often I hear the conversation turn to the what ifs of the worst case scenarios. And I think the reality of all the people that I've spoken to is that most of them are really trying and just need resources. And offering sort of a step by step approach to regaining agency and control and choice and freedom, you know, is possible and doable. And the best way to really get people, you know, the resources that they need to function, right? This people who end up in incarcerated settings not because they're moral failures, but because we haven't provided them the important resources, the services, the education, the pro-social engagement opportunities that they need to succeed. And so that's what we need to be offering them. That's a starting point.
Appreciate that. We're kind of up against time. And then my next question I
So
want to ask
sorry.
you, and I won't really ask a question, I'll actually unpack it a little bit. Everything you said made me think about like approaching this from a public health approach to mental health and incarceration and the practices that are needed for both prevention and reentry. You often talk about how difficult it is in the carceral space to get that, but it makes me thinking about some of the other comments you made earlier about young people in your research already coming in contact with the judicial system with high ACEs score. You said an average of 10. And so, I just want to leave it on this note. We're kind of up against time, but it makes me think about we need to, like, you said a whole system shift, right? And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that our approach should be to use a public health approach to this by, number one, looking at the causes to a phenomenon, looking at people as a vulnerable group, and then engaging in the process that allows us to attack and or address the issues that led up to the issue, and as well as provide the treatment while incarcerated and once they're released. But I think the most important thing to do would to be engaged upstream, some upstream treatment
Mhm.
before a person even incurred damage, right? Because we know that the pathway to some time incarceration oftentimes lead to victims in that process. And so I just want to say I appreciate you for speaking to that, and I think that kind of allows me to segue to highlight one of the most important things that I think that we need as society to do, which is really look at these issues through a public health lens.
Mhm.
We have about 1 minute left. Could you just provide us with maybe some more perspectives based on what I just said in my last comment and or overall before we close out?
Yes. If you think about major traumatic things that happen in our society, what we see is an influx of support, of resources, of sympathy, of awareness. And those things are all lacking from, kids in neighborhoods that are largely ending up in the criminal justice system. And I think if we had that same public health framework that we have for sort of more publicized violent issues and sort of had that same mindset for these kids, I think we'd see a whole completely different world.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thomas. You provided a great deal of insight in this phenomenon. I appreciate your work. I appreciate you for having us on the show. For having you on the
Thank you very
show,
much.
and we look forward to seeing some of your research out here and sharing it with our viewers. And I just want to say on that note, thank you to our viewers for joining us for another thought-provoking discussion. On behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. If you're interested in finding more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the website at thefortunesociety.org. That's thefortunesociety.org, or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Reggie Chapman, and I appreciate you for joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars. Thank you.